That's why I have you around, so you can think about it and worry about it, and I can just postulate every once in a while, and then we can go on and talk about other things that, like the war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today my guest is Dr. Shawn Williams, and we're going to be discussing the Ukraine. Dr. Williams is lead professor of political science at Campbellsville University, and I've asked him here today to join me to help me understand the war in Ukraine. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Let me first say that regardless of anyone's political views, we should all be very concerned about the humanitarian crisis happening in Ukraine. And my deepest prayer is for the peace, grace, and healing to those directly impacted by the conflict and for humanity as a whole. So where do you want to start? I've got some basic questions, and probably you get tired of answering these, but I guess my basic one is, how did we get here? Or not, I mean, us from a distance, but how did this happen?
Yeah, I guess it really depends on how far back in history you want to go. The short answer to the question is probably about 5 or 6 years old. The long-term question the answer to the question goes back 1,000 years. The territory that is today Ukraine, especially the territory around Kyiv, is considered to be the homeland of the Russian people. The origins of the Russian state are actually in modern Ukraine, and over a period of 1,000 years, the Russian state and the Russian people kind of migrated to the east. So for many Russians, what we're talking about is really kind of a battle for their homeland. The Russian Orthodox Church was founded in what is today modern Ukraine, and so it is their religious and spiritual homeland. So if you go back 1,000 years, they have deep roots in the soil there. But if you wanted to talk more short term, there are a series of political moves that have happened within the political structure of Ukraine, as well as some things that happened with NATO, some things that happened in American politics that kind of made this the right time for Vladimir Putin to make his move.
Yeah, I think maybe that's what I'm interested in. You know, what are the things that we were part of that, you know, and I sort of understand that NATO is part of that, but I think that's more to it.
So when we think about the question of why does a country go to war or when do we go to war, what our strategic literature tells us is that war is the choice that you make when you think that you can get the best deal through conflict as opposed to peace. If you're trying to accomplish your goals and you think that peace is a better option, that the price that I have to pay is cheaper, if I'm willing to be patient enough and I get what I want, you would much rather pursue non-military goals or non-military tactics to achieve your goals. So if you're a Vladimir Putin is willing to try to play peaceful control over Ukraine as long as he thinks he'll eventually get what he wants out of that.
Now, that's sort of what was going on the few presidents before Zelensky, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, but
they were pro-Russian, what
effectively.
I understand.
There was a period back in the 1990s where a pro-Western president, basically presidential candidate, won the presidential race. And there was an orange revolution in Ukraine where the goal was to try to destabilize the political system. And ultimately, the traditional forces, the pro-Russian forces, were able to win that through a series of authoritarian moves. And so Russia was able to maintain control over Ukraine.
But they had been sort of in control.
And effectively had been in control.
We're talking about a few years then between the fall
and then it was only recently with essentially the last couple of presidential elections, and most recently the election of Zelensky, that I think made Putin realize that the combination of Zelensky as president of Ukraine and Biden as president of the United States, the fact that Angela Merkel had just lost the chancellorship in Germany, which suggested that there might be a bit of a power vacuum in Europe, since Germany has traditionally been the leader of Europe, meant that now might be the time where there's enough uncertainty that he'd be able to move quickly and achieve his objectives.
So if I'm understanding what you've said so far is Ukraine is situated as, even though it would sort of be considered the cradle of the Russian people. Over the past 1,000 years, it's sort of moved eastward in terms of, over time it's moved eastward in terms of who the Russian people
there's
are.
like this belt, and I don't want to call it a no man's land because that'd be offensive to the Ukrainians and the Poles, but there's this belt that stretches from the North Sea to the Black Sea. On one side of this belt, you have the German Empire, the German principalities, you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what we'd call the old Holy Roman Empire. And to the east of that, you have what is today modern Russia, that after the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, the establishment of the Soviet Union, you had sort of the industrial section of Russia established in and around Moscow. This belt from Poland to Ukraine has been this breadbasket that's been fought over by these major empires for the last 300-400 years. And the Ukrainian people have been kind of caught in the middle of that.
And it also sounds like a pull towards the Russian or side versus the European side, which easily, and probably forever has been very distinct in terms of personalities and the societies, et cetera.
One of the consequences of the collapse of the end of World War I and the rise of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the old pre-World War I status quo, is that the Soviet Union basically came to dominate the region. After World War II, whenever the Soviet Union and the Allied powers defeated Germany, that control over what is modern Ukraine was solidified. And so the map of modern Ukraine was basically drawn after World War II as a result of World War II. And for the last 80 years, the Soviet Union before and then later Russia sort of dominated the politics. And not just the political machinations of the region, but the cultural politics, the religious politics, the demographics of the region. And so the Russians have used their control politically to establish cultural and demographic control, at least over eastern Ukraine. And that's what brought us to the conflict today.
Okay. Meaning that Russia wants culturally to be more significant in Ukraine?
Yeah, one of the strategies that is often used by empires, and the United States used it as we were establishing control over the western portion of our country, is if there is a people who are already there, you want to try to relocate them. The way the Russians tried to relocate the Ukrainians was essentially to either relocate them to Siberia, or there was a massive famine in 1927 to 1929. By 1931, 3.5 million Ukrainians had died as a result of the famine that was entirely orchestrated by the Soviet
an
government.
artificial famine, not the rain just didn't fall.
Essentially, the Soviets went in and took all the food, pulled it out of eastern Russia, and let the population die, and then replaced that population with native Russians, with ethnic Russians.
As much as I'm amazed at how good people are, I can also be amazed at how you essentially are starving a population.
It starved 3 million
so
people.
that you could get your people in and your culture in particular.
Correct.
Okay, so here we are in this country that, and I did at least a little research. It's about the size of Texas, so it's an amazing and nice sized area.
And it's not only the size of Texas, but it shares a lot of geographic characteristics. So it's essentially the breadbasket of the region. Roughly a fifth of all of the wheat produced that feeds Europe and Asia is produced in Ukraine, in much the same way that Texas is kind of the cotton and wheat breadbasket of the plains area.
Yeah.
And so it shares a lot of geographic, not just simply the size, but in terms of it has a lot of oil reserves in the same way that Texas does.
So a lot of natural resources,
Right.
a lot of agricultural resources.
Among the largest deposits of uranium in the world. Yeah.
Okay, and so that's big. Just that from the standpoint of the natural resources and uranium in particular, and it was industrialized. I mean, I know that Soviet industrialization, we may look at it as, but.
One of the strategies that the Soviets pursued after the end of World War II, they basically picked up industries that were in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Germany and Central Europe, and they literally tore apart factories and then just moved those factories into the Soviet Union. Some of those factories were moved to Russia itself, some were built in Ukraine. And then during the Stalin era and the Khrushchev era, whenever the Soviets were really pushing for mass industrialization, because it's geographically close to the Black Sea and there's a warm water port that the Ukrainians can access, they built a lot of the heavy industry near the Black Sea coast.
So Houston, essentially.
Essentially, yeah, if
something.
we're making the comparison right, it would be the city of Mariupol would be.
I don't mind making
Yeah.
good comparisons to a great state.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, it's exactly the same kind of concept. And so they built heavily in that industrial zone because that'd be the easiest place to get goods to the coast, and they could either transport that back into Russia or to the Eastern Europe. Or
so there's a lot of
trade.
reasons that Ukraine is it should be a strong nation. It sounds like. I mean, you've got the
absolutely.
agriculture, you've got the natural resources, you've got transportation, you've got access to just about every. I mean, you've got port access, you've got land access to different. You've got Europe, you've got. I guess the Middle East, you've got Russia.
Yeah, and because of
wow.
its geopolitical location, again, part of the why now, what's happening right now. One of the things that Germany chose to do strategically after the tsunamis in Japan that led the world to sort of doubt the viability of nuclear energy, Germany made the strategic choice to power down many of its nuclear power plants and to instead turn to Russia as its source of natural gas and heating oil. Most of those pipelines were built across Ukrainian territory, and then Ukraine has some oil capacity of its own, and they would just simply could then dump some of their own oil supply.
So was it just Germany or the rest of Europe?
Well, Germany made the strategic decision to power down nuclear plants, but Russia supplies heating to much of Europe. Especially Central Europe, and maybe not as far west as, say, Spain, but certainly most of Central Europe, Southern Europe.
So the main, so that central and slightly western part of Europe, maybe as far as France and some of those in the northern countries there,
Down through Romania, Bulgaria, as far as south as Greece.
are dependent a lot upon what comes out of the Ukraine, and particularly the pipeline that flows
through it. Yeah.
Okay, well that sets the stage.
Yep.
Now I understand a bit why.
And there's been one of the things that Russia had been attempting to do prior to their invasion of Crimea in 2014 was they were wanting to build a second pipeline basically through the Caucasus through Georgia to allow them to connect a pipeline through Southern Europe. That way they didn't have to depend upon the flow through the Ukrainian pipeline. But after the invasion of Crimea, that project was put on hold. One of the last things that Angela Merkel did before she left office was she decided to go ahead and resurrect the construction of that pipeline. But after the most recent invasion, that construction project has also been put on hold again.
So the stage is set, and Putin and Russia's been on one side watching all of this and eager to have Ukraine back, at least on their side, if not as part of them,
Right.
some alliance there. You have Europe, who depends, agriculturally and otherwise, and now what happens? And so 2014. When does Zelensky come in? 16, 18?
18, 2018, yeah. So a couple of things have happened in the last 4 years that I think changed the calculus, that made the decision to invade more logical for a madman. The rise of Zelensky in Ukraine suggested that Ukrainian politics had shifted away from Russia. So if Russia was going to move, the longer it waited, the harder it was going to be. When Donald Trump was in office, it wouldn't be fair to say that he was anti-NATO, but it's certainly fair to say that he was looking for a renegotiation of the responsibilities of NATO and a pulling back of the United States.
I do remember a little bit about that.
And so whenever you have a Trump president, it looks like NATO may be getting weaker over time rather than stronger. The election of Joe Biden suggests that the longer you wait, the more powerful that NATO might get. I mentioned that Angela Merkel, who'd been chancellor for over a decade in Germany, had recently left office. And so her replacement had yet to really take on a role in European politics. And so if you're a Putin, you're thinking, well, the longer that I wait, the less chance I have for succeeding in Ukraine. The longer I wait, the more likely it is that NATO will stand up to me. The longer that I wait, the more likely it is that Germany will have a role in the conflict. Yeah. Now is the best time for me to move. And probably would have moved earlier had it not been for the fact that the Olympics were in China. And from what we understand, the Chinese President Xi asked Putin to wait until the Olympics were over to launch the invasion, because the last two Olympics, Russia's actually used as cover for launching military incursions, either into Georgia or into Ukraine.
So the timing was right. The place had always been, it was
right. It was just a matter of timing.
And so politically, there'd been all this posturing to try to have influence with Ukraine. If I'm understanding it right, then there came a point where with the pro-Western sort of, I mean, he's a TV star, right? So, so there's a lot of, talking about cultural and social sort of ideas.
Zelensky was a comedian who became famous playing the role of a pro-Western president on television, and then was ultimately elected to the presidency as his sequel to that role.
You can't make that
plot line.
But
right.
then, I think some folks would love to see the guy from West Wing, right? I mean, if he would have run, it would have just, if it can be that great, then let's do it. Okay.
Or the comedian from Veep.
So Putin looks at it and it makes the calculation that now's the time.
Now's the time.
And makes the move. Mm-hmm. And he makes it in such a way that it looks weak. And if I'm and I'm not up on all the news, but it looks weak because tanks are breaking down, and
there appear to be a number of miscalculations on Putin's part, and many of these are fairly typical, almost to be expected in authoritarian regimes. It turns out that when you live in an increasingly authoritarian regime, telling the leader bad news is bad for your health. So when you have a declining economy in a state, you don't necessarily want to tell the leader that the economy is declining. When the military is no longer capable of replacing all their spare parts or fixing all of their equipment, you don't necessarily want to be the one that tells the leader that we have tanks that we can't actually operate because we don't have tracks for them anymore, or we don't have. There have been photographs of tanks that were stalled north of Kyiv that basically had brake fluid leaking from the brake drums, and you could see it leaking out from underneath the machines because they just weren't being taken care of. Yeah. And so Putin believed that he had this very powerful military, and the West largely agreed with him. But it turned out that much of the equipment. So
what they thought and were saying about their military, the West sort of
assumed to be true,
and now we're
finding out it wasn't.
Is there any risk that this is one of those art of war things where make them think you're weak, and then they show their hand?
I think that if
you understand what I'm asking? Like, put all the stuff that's gonna, that's crowding up our junkyards, and take that out there and make them think we're doing it old style.
One of the pieces of, and this may be factually true, or it may just be Russian propaganda, one of the arguments that was made was that, well, what Russians were doing was they were firing weapons that didn't actually have live rounds as a way of identifying where the Ukrainians had their missile sites located. Or they were firing missiles that didn't actually have explosives on the missiles, so they could see where the Ukrainians were launching their anti-missile defense systems. So the Russians could then come through and attack those. And there may be some truth to that. But we remember that long 20-mile line of tanks and anti-aircraft artillery that basically stalled north of Kyiv. That probably wasn't a propaganda tactic, right? There's too much equipment there for the Ukrainians to just be able to destroy.
It'd be tough to go past that, though, to get into the western part. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a military person.
But most of the territory that is ethnically Russian isn't north of Kyiv. It's to the south. And so again, if you were going to try something like that to just sort of blockade the road, you'd have come from the southern route rather than trying to come in from the north. And so there's some evidence to suggest that there's been a bit of that. I think the Russians could make the argument that they were trying to launch a quick strike to Kyiv to end the war quickly and painlessly. And when they found out that that wasn't going to happen, now they're entering a second phase of the war, which is more of a secure the territory they actually wanted, now that they know the Ukrainians aren't going to just quickly surrender. But
So you may have people leaving that area that you wouldn't want there necessarily anyway because they're not, pro-Russian. And so that brings up the idea that, do you think Putin's actually won?
it depends on how the war ends, right? So I think that if you're, again, trying to think like Putin, what Putin would want to do is basically drive all the Ukrainians out of eastern Ukraine, take control of the territory, and then move in native Russians. Potentially the families of soldiers, once the soldiers are there, you could simply tell the soldiers, we're not going to give you land as payment for what you've done. And so that first part of that project they've accomplished. The
And I don't
Ukrainians
want
are
to, I hate to
absolutely
interrupt
moving
you, but
out.
this
Yeah.
sounds so much like the past.
Sure.
And I'm talking about thousands of years,
right.
eons.
And Putin has been saying for the last
Wow.
15 years that he wants to resurrect the old Russia. He is intellectually an agent of the Soviet Guard, a former KGB agent. And much of what he has done suggests that he might be using that same logic of 50 to 100 years ago. That what this is really about is it's really about territory. It's about Russia being able to have access to the Black Sea. It's about trying to consolidate the military power that they had previously had in the Crimea and building an effective land bridge so that Crimea is reconnected to Mother Russia. And to do that, we just move the Ukrainians out and move Russians in, which is how empires would have behaved for the last 2,000 years.
I want to ask you about how this war is different, and so far it doesn't sound different. It's new to me because I haven't studied it as much as you have. But I mean, in an age where everything, the technology is reigns, I don't feel like I'm hearing much that
So
gets...
there are two very major differences. And one of these, again, is I think that's something that nobody really planned for. And the other one is something that everybody should have seen coming. The first one, people always are planning to refight the last war. This is one of the truths of military conflict. And so we saw what happened in the Civil War, and now we're going to plan for the Civil War when World War I comes, but the technology has changed. Right. World War II is built around a World War I model, but the technology had changed. The Ukrainian forces have been able to very effectively use drone warfare, both against soft and hard Russian targets. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're using drone warfare to now attack targets within Russia because the range of their drone technology is sufficient to fly hundreds of miles. That's not something that's ever been used in a war like this before. We've used,
other than Iraq,
we've
Afghanistan.
used drones as a way of attacking individuals, right? We have a terrorist target in Yemen. The Saudi Arabians use drones. But what the Ukrainians appear to be doing
more widespread as a military tactic.
as a military,
okay.
right, as a strategic wing, they're using drone warfare to attack hard targets.
Okay.
That's relatively new. Something else that's very new, as I'd mentioned a second ago, that we had images, and I have friends of mine who've worked in the military, who do work in the military, and we communicate via social media and other means, and they can show me photographs that are being published on the internet of Ukrainian tanks and anti-aircraft equipment. And using those photographs, they're able to tell me the conditions of this equipment and physically what's wrong with it or what might be working with it, what the problems might be. These are photographs that are being shared over social media using cell phone technology.
So they're getting crowdsourced technical support.
Crowdsourced technical support.
Wow.
And so for the Ukrainians who are attempting to fight a war against Russia, and for the Ukrainians who are trying to fight a propaganda war against Russia, they've been able to effectively use social media in ways that I don't think have ever been used in this type of a conflict before. They're able to galvanize global opinion. And they're able to get around the Russian firewall using social media.
Sort of the Arab Spring sort of thing, getting the
Correct.
the consciousness on your side, if you will.
In ways that we've never seen in this kind of a land war over territory before.
What about some of the hacking stuff that we were so afraid that Russia or anyone, I mean, any,
Sure.
I don't know if hostile, but not necessarily America's favorite countries. I mean, what about that in terms of like shutting things down, infrastructure and
If you
those types of things?
if you think back to World War II history, again, we're always refighting the last war. In the history of World War II, we talk about how World War II began in 1941, because that's when we were attacked with at Pearl Harbor. But if you ask Europe, World War II started in 1939, and if you ask Asia, World War II started in 1936, 1932. Because there were these periods where countries were at war and the United States said we're basically going to maintain neutrality.
So the Japan-China conflict started that much earlier?
Yeah, the invasion, the
So
Japanese...
20-some years of Japanese invasion?
The Japanese invasion of Manchuria had happened a full 5 to 10 years, depending on when you talk about the invasion taking place. But certainly by 1936, they had firm control over Manchuria. But the United States didn't get involved in that conflict for 5 years, because there was this period of time...
didn't really get involved until Pearl Harbor.
Right.
I mean, that was really the...
Right. And so there's this period of time where countries basically understand the United States may be helping my opponent, but if the United States isn't attacking me, that's better for me. So the fear, I think, is that if Russians were to deploy their hacking network to attack the American power grid, for example, the United States would become militarily involved. If we perceive that there is an actual threat on American territory or on American-owned resources, the Americans might become militarily
The full
involved.
brunt of our...
And that's something that the Russians, and as do we, like the United States doesn't want to get involved in a land war against the Russians in Ukraine because the consequences...
So here's some missiles and some bullets and some monies.
There's a level of support that we can provide the Ukrainians that the Russians are going to say, if we go too far, there may be worse consequences.
So where does NATO come in then? I mean, that isn't... And I know that Ukraine's not a NATO country.
Correct.
But there was hope. I mean, that was part of the ideas that it would be. Wouldn't you want to see those people who said, hey, we'll protect you, like, kind of like show me? Like, okay, what do you mean by that? If this is your idea of protection...
to be clear, part of the reason why we're providing assistance to Ukraine is we're bound by treaty to assist them should Russia ever attack.
It sounds like World War I.
Whenever the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had a sizable stockpile of nuclear weapons because, being intelligent, the Russians placed nuclear weapons as close to Europe as they could, so that way if the Europeans were to attack their nuclear weapon silos, they're not attacking Russian territory. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. worked with the Ukrainian government, and we basically made a promise that if Russia should ever attack you, we will provide you with assistance if, in exchange, you give us your nuclear stockpile. Because we're really afraid of nuclear proliferation, and we were afraid what would happen if the Ukrainian government were to collapse.
As we should be.
And the nuclear material would be able to enter into the black market. And so the Ukrainians accepted the deal. We provided them with military assistance and financial assistance and certain security guarantees. In exchange, they basically turned over their nuclear weapons to the West. Well, now we're being asked to make good on those promises. But NATO didn't agree to that. The United States did.
I see.
And the thing we talked about earlier, that many of the NATO countries are dependent upon Russia for fuel. Well, it's cold in the European winters, which is why it makes sense for Russia to attack in the winter. Because if Russia could have attacked and ended the conflict before it got too warm in Europe, then the Europeans wouldn't be able to do
feeling
anything,
it, so to speak,
because they would have to feel the cold of the winter. And so Germany especially, but even France, they have been very hesitant to get involved, in part because they know that their citizens would feel the cold, literally, if they were to get more aggressively involved in protecting Ukraine.
As you were speaking and had been talking about this, and just wondering how, as this progresses, how can it end peacefully? Or can it end? I mean, I guess it I mean, okay, peacefully as far it's gone, but
Right.
how can it? Is possibility of it ending where each side says, okay, well, this was bad, so let's just. Russia's not going to go back.
Yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where a Vladimir Putin-led Russia admits that they made a mistake and completely withdraws from Ukrainian territory. I can't imagine a scenario
So
where
there's
Russia.
some geopolitical stuff that's
Yeah.
going to redraw some lines.
Yeah, they're not going to accept, a Vladimir Putin-led Russia is not going to accept an agreement less than what they started out with before the conflict began. And so that makes peace difficult because ultimately Ukraine's going to have to accept giving up some territory. That becomes easier the fewer Ukrainians there are in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
So one of the consequences of the brutality of the war is that it becomes easier for Ukraine to just accept these people are never going to go back home again. And if the West would agree to repatriate or to support the relocation of some of these citizens, either to Europe or to Western Ukraine, that makes peace easier. But to your broader question, whenever I've been talking about this with my students, one of the things that I've said is that the way that this ends is probably with Russia becoming a vassal of the Chinese empire. Because if we look,
if
yeah,
you're saying that China will control
if we look
Russia.
5 or 10 years into the future, and so look past what's happening this month, look past what's happening through 2022, the Russian economy is basically going to become dependent upon the Chinese economy, because there are very few countries in the world that are willing to continue to buy and sell on a 1-to-1 ratio with the Chinese or with the Russians. Very few countries that are willing to accept rubles as form of payments as opposed to the American dollar, which is the normal form of payment. China's been one of those countries. So over time, the longer this goes, the more dependent upon the Chinese economy Russia becomes. The more stressed the Russian economy becomes, the more it's going to need an influx of
Susceptible
external
to,
capital.
yeah.
And the only country that's going to be willing to invest in Russia is going to be China.
Because I was wondering about China. We hadn't heard much in a while.
I think part of it is that there's some geopolitical
Speaking
reasons.
of the art of war, let's
Yeah, I think there's some geopolitical reasons why Russia wanting to take back its territory in Ukraine looks similar to China wanting to reclaim Taiwan, and I think that there's some truth to that. But I honestly think if you think 10 or 15 years in the future, the worse this is for Russia, the better it is for China, because China will become the logical country to help
alternatives
rebuild.
to a lot of things like fuel and food and
Correct. An alternative resource for capital, an alternative target for. There's already a plan in the works to build. They call it the Polar Highway. They're building an oil transportation system, a pipeline that goes from Siberia to China, so
Straight
that China
down
can
to
become a market for Russian oil. So if the Europeans won't accept Russian oil, China becomes the place that receives all of Russian oil. And it's one thing for a bunch of countries to be dependent upon you, but when Russia's economy is dependent on selling all their resources to China, China becomes the dominant
it's
player.
always the spin you put on, and I don't mean spin in a bad way, but
Sure.
the twist that you put on it
Yeah.
that may always.
So I think at the end of the
Because
day,
Putin might have been, hey, now's a good time.
right.
I mean,
But the longer this
go
goes,
ahead.
the better it is for
China,
Xi.
and it's got to be good for China already.
Sure.
I mean, they didn't come out against him,
Right.
and
They're able
we're
to buy,
still going to buy their stuff.
They're able to buy oil at below market prices because Russia can't sell it to anyone else, except for there are a few other countries, India being one that's still accepting Russian oil reserves. But for the most part, very few other countries, a growing number of products nobody will buy from Russia, and there are a growing number of products that nobody will sell to Russia, except for the Chinese.
So part of this, wow, that puts a whole new twist to it all, because part of this was, from my understanding, was that Putin was wanting to get the homeland back. It was about bringing Russia back to its prominence as a world leader.
Absolutely.
But if I hear what you're saying, all it does is put China in even a better spot. It was already in a good spot,
Had everything gone the way that Putin thought it was going to,
which means they have one instead of two.
yeah,
Go ahead.
had everything gone the way Putin thought it was going to, if this had been a 2 or 3 week long conflict, had they driven straight to Kyiv, had the Ukrainians laid down, had they accepted some kind of a renegotiation of the borders, had this all been done already, then Vladimir Putin would have been very correct in his decision. That's not happening. And there's no indication that Ukraine is planning on simply laying down its arms anytime soon. The longer the conflict goes, the better off China actually is from all this.
What about us then, and Europe? The longer it goes, the better it is for us. Is that? I mean, is it a? And I get your thing about China. My question is, we've got interest too, and having a weaker, even weaker than maybe, I mean, really maybe even seeing how weak it is what I heard you say earlier militarily, that we're seeing that maybe the leadership is weak and they aren't as strong militarily. That's sort of good for...
Having Russia weaker is good for Europe. Having Russia a vassal in the Chinese empire is not good for Europe. And this has been true for decades. Whenever we granted most favored nation status to the Chinese in 1992, when Richard Nixon went to China back in the 1960s and the 1970s, or went to Russia in the 60s and went to China in the 1970s, these moves were basically designed to try to drive a wedge between Russia and China. The idea of a Russian...
went to the oil dollar and got off the gold standard.
The idea of an allied Russia and allied China has always been kind of terrifying to the United States, terrifying to Japan, terrifying to our allies. And so a weakened Russia is certainly to our advantage, but a China that has control over Russian resources, a China that has control over the Russian oil industry, a China that has control over Russian uranium deposits, that's not necessarily...
And they need a lot of energy to drive all that manufacturing going on, and to keep an economy. I mean, they've over, 30 years, maybe 40, become the
economic power on par to the United States, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't mean economically just the amount, but production. I mean, they are killing the production, and you know, of course, we're awful nice to give them all the technology that they want
and buy all the technology from them. Yeah. But if you imagine, China's a country with over 1 billion people, but only about 25% of the land in China is actually arable, whereas Russia has massive territory that could be easily transformed into very productive, the breadbasket of Europe. And so, yeah, I think, so to answer the original question that you asked, when does this end? I think it probably ends whenever China says we don't benefit anymore from this conflict. Russia, if you want our continued help, if you want our investment dollars, you're going to find a way to end this.
Interesting.
And that may take a bit.
Yeah.
It may take a while.
I'd like to go back a little bit to talk about technology and, in particular, psychological warfare, and that's always been a thing. I mean, there's been propaganda all the time, and you know the monsters are them, and we're the the saviors, and I don't mean just whichever side. You know, how is that playing out? What are you hearing going on there?
It is much more difficult because of the ethnic and historic relationship between the Ukrainian and the Russian people. It would be very similar to the ability of the United States to demonize Great Britain in the War of 1812, right? We were relatively close historically and genetically we're relatively close to our British ancestors.
So thus demonizing Putin as opposed to, so an individual, yeah, but not a culture or a society.
But to convince the Russians that the Ukrainians are evil, certainly they've tried to do that, but they had to narrowly focus that on the people who are in control of Ukraine. In fact, part of the propaganda that Putin was using was that neo-Nazis had taken over the Ukraine and that what we needed to do is go into our homeland and save our people from the forces that are controlling Ukraine. For them to be able to say the Ukrainian people are evil is rough. For the Ukrainians to say that about the Russian citizens is difficult.
And on the other hand, though, there was at least a couple of weeks ago, perhaps maybe longer, the idea that those same groups were a benefit to Ukraine. And so we're, on one side, before we would have been like, no, neo-Nazi bad,
six
but all of a
months or a
sudden
year
they're
ago.
fighting for,
Right.
I say us, I mean, the side that we're supporting. So it just seems like there's a lot of opportunity for some psychological effects and working that.
I think in terms of the ability of, for example, you'd mentioned the Russian ability to use hacktivists. I think in terms of the ability of Russians to use social media to target individual level Ukrainians or to target individual level Russians with propaganda, that would certainly be very, very effective. However, the types of tactics they can use or the techniques that they can use, it's harder because you can't demonize an enemy when you go to the same church that they do. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is relatively young. Up until 20 years ago, most of Ukraine worshipped at the Russian Orthodox Church. The establishment of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been
Is
less
that
than
more
15
or less
years.
a reformist movement?
Effectively.
Same thing, but
Be
just
like Episcopalians and Anglicans,
Okay.
right? Or Roman Catholics versus Mexican Catholics or Irish Catholics, right? They're essentially the same thing. And so it's hard to demonize another person when that other person looks and acts so much like you. Russia is one of the dominant languages in Ukraine. Most Ukrainians can speak Russian. It's hard to demonize the people who speak the same language that you do, as compared to what we were able to do against the Japanese in World War II, or they were able to do against the Chinese because of the ethnic differences. It's more difficult.
And I've known, I at least have heard that we've, and I say we, the media outlets and the social media institutions are trying to limit Russian access and trying to, and that's not new, right? I mean, it's whether it was a newspaper or placard or whatever it is. I mean, it's part of the whole
We don't want them to have a chance to tell their side of the story.
Yeah. And so, so my guess is that that's limited. Do you think that comes into play in terms of freedom of speech? And what I mean by freedom of speech is freedom to have a real discourse. Do you think that plays a part in a freedom of expression and understanding?
I think that in times of war, there's always been a general understanding that things like freedom of speech or freedom of press can be more curtailed than in times of peace. And so when we're in a situation where the United States is sending billions of dollars of military aid, and let's not kid ourselves, we're going to find out 5 or 10 years from now that American satellites and spy technology have been used to help Ukrainians target Russian assets. We're already finding out now that Elon Musk was paid by the American government to send internet access to the Ukrainian government. Like, we're going to find out there's been more.
Is that why he became the
richest man over? Yeah, it doesn't hurt. When you have your own satellite-based internet company and you can help privately fund a war, that doesn't hurt. We're going to find there's a lot more assistance the American government's providing than just
you ever have
bullets.
those moments of decisions of when we were younger to should have gone into some satellite technology instead of
There've been a couple of interviews that I've had in the past that I'm like, I should have had a second follow-up interview with that particular firm or agency.
Yeah, and to your point, it's in times of conflict, in times of war like this, and sides have to be taken, if you will.
Yeah, and I think, however we conceptualize this, there are 3 possible sides the United States could take. One side is that we have no business being involved in Ukraine. One side is that it's in our vested interest to make sure that Russia doesn't grow more powerful. And the other one is that we actually side with the Russians on this and say that maybe the European theater is more stabilized if Russia provides a strong balance to the European Union. That option, a strong Russia, is certainly not the option that we're going to take. What appears to have happened is that we as a people and our government have taken the position that we should be supporting the Ukrainians, that Russians are clearly the aggressor, and that we're better off with a constrained or contained Russia. And in that environment, it's sort of logical that we would limit propaganda in opposition to our position.
the thing that I was am wondering right now is, and you're very intelligent, so don't take this the wrong way, but if we're talking about it, there's probably people with some actual decision making.
Sure.
And so if Russia becoming a vessel of China is not a good idea, that puts us in a really bad position to be able to help them, but not help them, help Ukraine, but not. My question
Sure.
being like, this is a really strategic.
So if you think about how far could the United States go in launching an economic and intellectual war against China, we haven't gotten anywhere close to that yet. I mean, we're taking steps to limit their access to the American economy. We're taking steps to limit their access to get immediate capital. We're trying to do things that would limit their ability to get resources to buy more guns and tanks. But we haven't done anything to try to cripple their oil industry or to try to cripple their industrial complex. There doesn't appear to be any evidence of the United States trying to use our hacking ability to shut down their industry. And I think we're not doing those things because we recognize there's a long game here and that we would like to stop Russia, but we don't want to break Russia.
Yeah.
Because a broken Russia is not in our best interests.
I don't see how statesmen keep their sanity. I can't, and maybe that's why we're in academia. We can talk about it. We don't have to get out there and because that seems like we don't think that far. I don't think that far ahead, and I certainly don't have that strategic vision. And so I'm glad that there are people like yourself who get it and understand it. It just seems, and that you have to, even though you can look long term, you're still going step by step. You're still having to make the next move, the tactical move, the short term objective, but how you reaching that long term goal.
Where's the world 20, 30, 40 years from now?
Yeah.
And it's not in our best interests 20, 30, 40 years from now for Russia to be a failed state.
To be a northern China province.
Right. To be, that's certainly not in our interests.
Yeah.
Because 20 years from now, we may need a rival to China that doesn't exist right now. And certainly, we would want to limit the Chinese access to resources without having, as long as China has to go to the open market to acquire those resources, that's one thing. But if they were able to just stick a straw into the Russian oil wells and drain out all that they needed at whatever price they felt like paying, this is problematic for us.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to add? You've given me so much more insight and a lot of things I need to think about. But what do you want to add?
I think the way that you opened the show, I think you captured the feelings of a lot of us, that we recognize we can have this academic conversation about the future of American politics in the region or what's happening with NATO, but there are people who are legitimately suffering. And we need to not lose sight of the fact that this is a story about a country of millions of people being displaced. Right now we're looking at 2 to 3 million refugees. This will probably end with 4 to 5 million Ukrainians no longer in the country, and
out of a population of how many?
40 million. And
so 10% of their population is going to be
forced to flee, and another 50% will probably be internally displaced before the conflict is over. And the human suffering is something that we should not lose sight of, which is again why I think we have to be on the Ukrainian side here, because the Russians are the ones who are causing the suffering. Yeah. Even as we recognize that if we go too far in punishing Russia for its activities, it's not in our best long-term interests.
Gotcha. Well, as always, it's a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for being here.
Yes, sir. Thank you.